There was a time when I believed that the most effective way to teach my students was to wield the power of correction with force, precision, and, if I'm honest, some pleasure. In my hands, the red pen wasn't just a tool. It was the sword of judgment. Every mark I made, every bold line of ink, was my stamp of authority. I'd sweep through their papers like a monarch, deciding the fate of a kingdom. In my classroom, failure wasn't just a possibility. It was a certainty. The students knew it, I knew it, and the red ink would prove it. No sentence went unchecked. No paragraph was left without my bold X's, my emphatic fail, unsatisfactory, try again. I found a sick satisfaction in seeing a paper drenched in red, as though every mark was an opportunity to teach the lesson again. It didn't matter how hard they tried or how much effort they put in. It wasn't good enough. Not for me. I would hand back papers with a smirk, watching their faces drop as they scanned the pages. Their hopes dashed in an instant, their hearts sinking as they saw what they had done wrong. I wasn't cruel. I was simply thorough. My corrections, while harsh, were meant to push them toward perfection. If they couldn't handle the correction, they didn't deserve the grade. I would tell myself, they need to learn. They need to understand the value of being flawless. They need to see what failure feels like to know how to rise again. And then, there was her. One student in particular, a shy girl who rarely spoke in class, who often fidgeted in her seat and would glance down at her paper, unsure if she was doing the right thing. Maria. She wasn't the brightest. Her papers were filled with mistakes, spelling errors, missing commas, incomplete thoughts. The red ink on her pages practically bled through the paper, marking her as unsatisfactory, needs improvement, try harder next time. But what really stood out was the way she never complained. She never lowered her head in shame. Instead, she came up to me after each paper was returned, her eyes full of determination. "Thank you, ma'am," she would say, voice soft, but steady. "I'll do better next time." And that's when it happened. One day, I returned a particularly disastrous set of papers. My red pen had worked overtime that day, painting the pages in a vivid display of failure. The room was quiet as usual. The students knew what was coming. They scanned their papers, groaning, sighing. Some put their heads down in defeat. Maria was the last to look at her paper. Her face was unreadable at first. And then, just as she was about to turn away, she looked up at me. Her eyes locked with mine. She smiled. Not a shy, hesitant smile. It was a smile of realization, of growth. And then, without warning, she walked over to my desk. To my surprise, she threw her arms around me in a tight hug. I stood frozen for a moment, not sure how to respond. My mind raced. What was this? Why was she hugging me? "Thank you, ma'am," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "I've never learned so much in my life. You know, when you mark my papers, I can see everything I need to improve. I know where I went wrong, and that's why I'm going to try harder." My heart skipped. It was as if all the red pen marks, the thousands of red strokes that had been a symbol of failure, were now transformed. They were no longer just mistakes. They were lessons. For the first time, I understood something. I had been so obsessed with being right, with showing my students their mistakes, that I had missed the bigger picture. Correction didn't have to be punitive. It didn't have to be painful. Maria had shown me something I hadn't seen before. Correction wasn't just about pointing out flaws. It was about teaching them how to move forward, how to grow, how to see their own potential beyond the mistakes. She hadn't been discouraged by my red pen. She had embraced it. She had used my corrections as fuel for improvement, not as a chain that held her back. That was the day I learned the real power of teaching. It wasn't in the force of my corrections or the boldness of my red marks. It was in the gentleness of encouragement, in showing my students how to see their own mistakes and learn from them. And so, I made a decision. From that day on, I stopped using the red pen. Instead, I took up the blue pen. The ink was softer, the lines lighter. The marks still showed where they had gone wrong, but now there was a subtle shift, a shift toward encouragement. Blue pen didn't scream failure like red pen did. It whispered, "You can do better." Blue pen left space for growth. The students noticed the change. At first, they were puzzled. Why was I no longer marking their mistakes so harshly? Why wasn't the paper flooded with angry red streaks? But slowly, they began to understand. They were no longer afraid of mistakes. They could see the difference between failure and growth. Maria's hug had taught me something invaluable, that sometimes the best way to teach isn't by showing how wrong someone is, but by showing them how to be right. The blue pen wasn't just a tool for writing. It was a tool for fostering hope, for cultivating resilience. From that moment on, I never looked back. And as I watched my students grow, as I saw them embrace their mistakes and correct them with confidence, I realized something deeper. True teaching is not about making mistakes disappear. It's about giving students the courage to face them,